Breaking news. After Putin's public shaming, the West will have to reevaluate its strategy for saving Ukraine. An exciting, but potentially even more perilous, future devoid of Russian President Vladimir Putin has just been hinted at. This significantly upped the stakes for the West in the conflict in Ukraine. Russia's bloody history of revolutions and coups was brought to mind by a mutinous weekend that saw mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin openly mock the Kremlin before abandoning his march on Moscow. War could redraw the map of Europe and modern history, and efforts by the White House and its foreign allies to find out exactly what was happening highlighted the war's volatility. A civil war that seemed imminent was ultimately avoided, at least for the time being. In a move that could secure his hold on power, the Kremlin strongman appeared to back down from a military confrontation with Prigozhin's Wagner group fighters. Putin's accusation of Prigozhin of treason and subsequent agreement to a deal that apparently allowed him to flee to exile in Belarus within hours later punched the deepest holes in the Russian president's authority in a generation. Putin's political survival is now in grave danger due to the war he started to destroy Ukraine. The ramifications have now spread to the rest of the world. This is not a temporary setback. It's like Prigozhin is the person who looked behind the screen at The Wizard of Oz and saw the great and terrible Oz was just this little frightened man. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine John Herbst told CNN's Christiane Amanpour about Prigozhin. This scandal will forever stain Putin's reputation. For Ukraine, which seeks breakthroughs against Moscow's already demoralized and poorly led troops in its new counteroffensive, the schisms in Moscow and between the government and Prigozhin's Wagner group, the only Russian fighting force that has enjoyed much recent battlefield success, may now conjure an opening. The West, which has financed and armed the country's struggle for survival, would welcome such an outcome. NATO leaders would also welcome Putin's departure, as there is currently no indication that he will withdraw his forces from Ukraine to end the conflict. There was some concern that a weak autocrat, the Russian military, and warring militia leaders could spark a civil war in a country that possesses a large nuclear arsenal. Such turmoil and unrest within Russia would have far-reaching geopolitical repercussions. There is no clear side for the West to take in the fighting that broke out over the weekend. The stage was set for a confrontation between Prigozhin, whose men have been accused of brutal human rights abuses in Ukraine, Syria, and Africa, and Putin, who has brought back the horrors of World War II to Europe, defied international law by invading a sovereign neighbor, and is wanted for alleged war crimes. Prigozhin is also not a friend of the United States. He has admitted to meddling in U.S. elections and has promised to do so again. By saying this was an internal Russian affair, Western leaders were trying to prevent Putin from using it to renew his claims that he is the victim of a Western plot to overthrow him, diminish Russia's status as a great power, and reduce its sphere of influence. According to CNN's Kevin Liptik, Biden called the leaders of France, Britain, and Germany and urged them to maintain a low profile and let events unfold in Russia in order to avoid World War III. No one in Washington is placing bets on a new Cold War-style standoff with Russia, but a schism in the Putin regime could signal an impending collapse that could eliminate one of Washington's major foreign policy challenges. Retired General David Petraeus said on CNN's State of the Union that the country shouldn't fall apart at the seams because it spans 11 time zones and includes republics in the Russian Federation with many different ethnic and sectarian groupings. Is Putin's downfall finally starting to take shape? We have no idea. Were Prigozhin to have been successful, we would have been concerned that whoever took over would be even more autocratic. Petraeus, a former CIA director, wondered aloud whether a more rational approach to Europe and the West might be possible. Could there actually be a pragmatic leader who steps in and realizes what a catastrophic error this whole Ukraine endeavor has been? A Ukrainian victory in this war has long been seen as a potential existential threat to Putin's rule. However, theoretical speculation is one thing. This new reality means that the West will have to reevaluate its delicate balancing act to save Ukraine after this weekend. The Russian leader's shame may prompt him to press for a particularly brutal push in a war that has already shown a shocking lack of compassion for ordinary Ukrainians. Putin's position could become even more precarious if political strife in Russia further damages the morale of its troops and leads to battlefield losses. After months of nuclear saber-rattling, this will only add to concerns that the Russian leader is threatening a catastrophic escalation of the war. If the war continues to get worse for Russia, and if the events of the past weekend were any indication, the West may be in for yet another headache. Putin faced months of heavy military losses and economic pain at home due to Western sanctions, but the most powerful resistance to him did not come from a democratic movement that he spent years crushing. It came from Prigozhin, a more extreme right-winger and brute than him. There were fears of a bloodbath in the streets of Moscow because another extreme and bloodthirsty warlord, Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, offered to help Putin put down the Wagner rebellion on Saturday. It's impossible to know what will happen in the bear pit of Moscow's politics behind the scenes, which is populated by thuggish militia chiefs, intelligence chieftains, and oligarchs. The unexpected events of the past few days have raised concerns that Russia's next leader will be even more unyielding and difficult for the West to deal with than Putin. The Internet Research Agency, a troll farm that Russia used to spread disinformation across social media in an effort to influence the 2016 presidential election, was one of Prigozhin's pet projects. We're all maybe excited to see that Putin's hold on power is shakier and the state is more fragile than we thought, said Robert English, an expert on Russia and Eastern Europe and the director of the School of International Relations at the University of Southern California. It won't be a liberal like Alexei Navalny or these other liberal critics of Putin, but rather a populist from the right who appeals to the same anti-elite, anti-corrupt instincts but has brutal dictatorial tendencies of their own, according to English. Washington is under the impression that Prigozhin's decision to halt his advance on Moscow is a result of a hastily announced truce brokered by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko is not the end of the story. It's too early to tell exactly where this is going to go, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on CNN's State of the Union on Sunday. This is probably a motion picture, I think. At the same time, Putin's credibility as a leader has taken a serious hit. His rule has always rested on his ability to appease the various factions that report to him. Blinken called the fact that a powerful figure in Russia had publicly challenged Putin's authority, something very, very powerful. It's too early to tell where or when these cracks will go, but it's clear that Putin will be faced with some new questions as a result. The United States and its allies have good reason to worry that a depleted Putin will resort to more extreme measures in order to reverse a war that threatens his hold on power. Biden has been adamant that a direct conflict between Russia and NATO should be avoided at all costs. However, the fact that the war is now causing deep splits within Russia that could compromise the integrity of its operations may be an argument for rapidly increasing Western assistance to Ukraine. Despite sending billions of dollars and advanced weapons to help Ukraine defend itself in the most sweeping transatlantic mobilization since the end of the Cold War, Putin's apparent vulnerability is likely to embolden those who argue that Biden has been too timid. Some argue that the West has provided Ukraine with just enough aid to keep it afloat, but not enough to force Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea and the rest of the country's armed forces out of the country. On Sunday, Republican presidential candidate and former CIA officer and Texas Congressman Will Hurd said that the United States and its allies were sending a weak message to Russian President Vladimir Putin by saying they were monitoring events in Russia. Another term exists for that. That, as Hurd put it, amounts to wringing your hands and doing nothing. We should have been planning with our allies, we should have been planning with the Ukrainians on how to take advantage of this opportunity, Hurd said on ABC's This Week on Sunday, referring to the time after intelligence reports indicated possible action by Prigozhin. Recently entering the race, Hurd is one of the few to focus his campaign on attacking the GOP frontrunner, former President Donald Trump.